Return of a slave woman, stolen or absconded from the house of Marius.
Damp earth, straw underfoot. Smoke crawls across the low ceiling. A peasant builds a house not for comfort, for the sake of surviving at least one winter. All he has, twigs, clay, dung, his hands, and the memory of how those before him survived. Walls are not protection, but delayed death. The hearth is not comfort, but a faint warmth that keeps the family on edge. No glass, no blueprints, no tools, only dirt, fear, and cold. Watch to the end and you'll understand why the medieval peasant house is not just a dwelling, but the most honest form of survival with no technology, no electricity, no chance for error. No plan, no blueprints, only a clearing, an axe, a whip, and knowledge that is not written down. It is passed on. A peasant doesn't build a house. He repeats the gestures of his father and grandfather. They knew which side to put the wall on so it wouldn't blow away, how to hammer a pole so it wouldn't sway, how to knead the clay so it wouldn't crack in winter. The frame construction is the basis of a peasant dwelling. Everything is simple. Vertical posts made of oak or spruce, burnt by fire to prevent rotting, willow or hazel twigs woven between the supports, clay, manure, straw, and sand. A mixture mixed in a pit and trampled by feet. The warmth of their hands, the smell of manure, the viscous silence all become a wall. Day after day they smear it. First one layer, then the second, then, as it turns out. The main thing is that it holds, not immediately, but forever. A house like this is not built alone. Neighbors help. The whole village comes. Who cuts stakes, who kneads clay, who carries water, who just stands around and waits to be called. There are no masters here, no superfluous. Every hand is the right hand. Every movement is a memory. The house goes up quickly, not for centuries, but for the winter. Such dwellings are found everywhere, in Poland and the Czech Republic, in Scandinavia, in England, in Russia. The names are different. Wattle and daub, torches, smokehouse, wattle and daub. The essence is the same. Everything from what is underfoot. Nothing extra, no nails, no shingles. Just wood, twigs, clay, air. It's dark inside. The walls hold the smoke. The window is a rag in the opening. But if the hearth doesn't go out, if the roof doesn't leak, if the walls withstand the frost, then it's built right. It's not home in the usual sense. It's the boundary between life and the absence of life. A house where there is nothing superfluous. Just what you need to wake up tomorrow, to keep the children warm, to keep the bread dry, so that at least someone would survive until spring. And that was enough. A peasant home doesn't start with choice. It starts with scarcity, poverty, from the land, which does not feed itself, but gives a little if you know where to look. To build is to take what is at hand, not what's best, it's what's available. A house is made not from construction calculations, but from the terrain. If a village stands on black soil, there will be clay. If there is a field nearby, there will be straw. If the village has a forest, there will be wood. If the cattle survive the winter, there will be dung. All this is combined not because it is beautiful, but because there is nothing else. Clay, manure, straw, sticks, bog peat, turf, stone, rubble, moss. It's not building materials, it's just stuff that didn't come in handy for food, or left over from work, or got in season, sometimes by accident. Clay from the riverbank, straw from the harvest, manure from under a cow, twigs from the vine behind the ravine. All this was not bought. It was collected like mushrooms, like brushwood, like eggs from under chickens. No saw, no nails, no mason was called. Only the monastery had bricks, the Lord had lime. A peasant's house was born of rough labor, of axe, of hoes, of fingers. If it didn't fit, they chopped in another way. If it wasn't enough, they laid it as it was, unevenly, crookedly, but firmly. The material dictated the form. Where there's wood, there's a log cabin. Where there was clay, there was a shack. Where sand and wind, turf and wattle and daub. Archaeologists see it clearly. In one region, the remains of clay walls in another, peat masonry in the third, a stone base assembled from boulders. The construction was not according to a scheme, but according to the weather, according to memory, according to the place. In Russia, walls were kneaded with clay and manure. In Scandinavia, they laid turf. In England, they wove rods and covered them with daub. In Poland, they built with adobe. In the Alps, they put pebbles and clay. Everywhere, differently, but for one reason, there were no other materials. It wasn't a project, it was a compromise between time, effort, season, and hunger. The house had to be finished before winter, which meant there was no time to bring stone from far away. There was no strength to build twice. There was no point in waiting for the planks to arrive. We took what we had. We used everything, every last limb. Even the moss was stripped from the rocks and stuffed into the gaps between the logs. Even grass was put in the roof. Even old shovels and pieces of cloth were used for insulation. The house was not an object, but an organism, assembled from remnants and silence. And yet, despite their poverty, these houses stood, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. They were repaired, propped up, repaired, changed straw, added rods, smeared with new clay, and lived on. A house like this was an extension of the land. It smelled of the field. It rotted as the leaves rotted. It didn't rise, it grew. And that was its truth. It didn't make life better, it just kept it from disappearing. A shallow pit has been dug in the center of the yard. It's a mess. Clay, water, manure, straw, sand. The odor is heavy, warm, steaming. The peasants step barefoot into the clay. Slowly, with effort, they stir it with their bodies, like dough for bread, just for the walls. The house doesn't start with the foundation. It starts with this hole. An earthen wall is not masonry or a carpenter's marvel. It is molding. First, a rough frame is put up, vertical stakes driven into the ground. Between them, rods woven into a wattle, flexible, brittle, fragile, until they are covered in clay. Then they become part of the body. It's hand-painted. Piles, palms, clumps, caulking gaps, rubbing corners. The surface is not smooth, it's rough and alive. The wall grows upwards from the ground. 1 day, 1 tier. 2 days, half a wall. 3 days, the whole facade. As it dries, it becomes stronger than it looks. The composition of the clay mixture is a knowledge conveyed not by words, but by fingers. Where there is more clay, the house will crack. Where there's more manure, the house will get damp. Where there's not enough straw, it will blow. Each region, each village, each family had its own composition. Sometimes they added ash, coal dust, bone meal, even dead grass. All for the sake of density, for strength, for warmth. The wall was up to 40 and sometimes 60 centimeters thick. It was enough to ward off the wind, to keep the hearth, to absorb the smoke. The wall was not an insulator, it was a battery. It didn't stop the cold, it slowed it down. In many regions of Europe, this technique was the main one. In Germany, Lehmbände in Scandinavia, turf with clay in Russia, mazanka in England, wattle and daub. The most amazing thing is that technique did not depend on culture, only poverty, only on what was at hand and what you can't wait for. Archaeologists are finding these walls, not as stone, not as wood, but as dust with straw inclusions. They're easy to miss, but if you're lucky, under your fingernail, you can find a fingerprint from 6 centuries ago. The mark of the woman who molded the wall, or a child holding onto a corner, or an old man who painted over a crack. A house with walls like that wasn't built to last, but if it was repaired, it stood for decades. Cracked, they'd put caulk on it. If it falls off, they put it back on again. In the spring, a new layer. After the rains, a new coat. A wall is like a skin. It lives and dies with its owner. The mud walls absorbed everything: soot, heat, moisture, odors. They darkened with time. They rustled under your hand. They weren't smooth, they were true. You could tell from them how many children there were in the house, how often the hearth was stoked, how poor the family was. An earthen wall is not about beauty, it's about necessity. It's about patience, it's about endurance. It's not a house with a story, it is history itself compressed in clay and straw. As long as these walls stood, life, however poor, still went on. The walls may be mud walls, the floor is just trampled earth, but if the roof leaks, there is no house. At the top, life begins, or where it ends. If it drips, it's cold. If it leaks, it rots. If it collapses, death. So in the peasant world, the roof is not an architectural element. It's the upper limit of survival. Straw was the first defense. Not the soft kind, not for cattle, but long, sturdy, dry after the harvest. Gathered in sheaves, tied in bundles, shaken out of seeds. It was laid in several layers from bottom to top, like scales. The thicker, the better. The thicker, the quieter. It took more than one cart to put on the roof, a whole field. The work was twofold. From the bottom they were feeding, from the top they were laying. Sometimes without a ladder, just from the wall. Sometimes with the help of two poles thrown across the roof. Wooden wedges were hammered in, poles were pressed down, stones were used to seal it. From above, the roof looked like the back of an animal. Rough, gray, but alive. The angle of the roof was the key. In areas with heavy rainfall, it was steep so that the water would run off quickly. In areas where rainfall was rare, it was sloping. A mistake in the slope, and the whole roof was useless. In the northern lands where there is little harvest and the grass is thicker, turf was used instead of straw. Turf is a piece of earth with roots, moss, and grass. It was cut with a sharply sharpened shovel in layers like a carpet. One layer was laid on the roof, moss down, then another layer on top. Between them, birch bark, peat, sometimes even straw, and tamped down again. A roof like that weighed tons, but it kept the heat in, and it held itself. Grass sprouted on these roofs in the spring. Sometimes flowers, sometimes moss, sometimes a goat. Literally in Scandinavia, livestock were allowed to graze on the roofs. In England, such a roof was called thatch. In France, chaume. In Germany, strohdach. In Russia, zhitnaya, zherdovaya, sudnaya. The materials are different, but the essence is the same. The roof was assembled from what could be cut or torn out. It had to be repaired every year. In the spring, we'd check what was rotten, replace the bundles. We filled the gaps with clay. Sometimes they just put a new layer on top of the old one, and so on, year after year, until the walls toppled. The roof never lasted forever. Mice lived in it, insects crawled in it, birds nested in it. Sometimes it rustled, sometimes it fell, sometimes it fell through. But it was the ceiling that held up the night. And in a downpour, the main thing was not to drip directly into the hearth. Everything else was tolerable. The roof in a peasant's house was not airtight, but it separated man from the sky, from the wind, from the rain, from snow. It was assembled by hand, with love, for life, not for beauty. And as long as there was straw, peat, or moss overhead, it was home. Anything else could be put up. As the sun sets behind the hill and darkness thickens in the cabin, there is only one thing left: the fire. It crackles in the center of the house, low, right on the dirt floor. It has no chimney. The smoke rises slowly upward, creeps up the slopes of the roof, drifts under the thatch. It envelops the house, soaks everything: the walls, the clothes, the hair, the breath. It is not the smoke of comfort. It is the smoke of survival. The hearth is not just a place to cook. It's the center of life. A house is built around it, not according to plan, but according to meaning. To keep warm where you sleep, light where they eat, where they give birth, where they die. Fire is the only permanent occupant of the house. It is not asked for, it is cherished. It is located in the center or slightly to the side, often on the bare ground, sometimes on flat stones if they can be found. Framed by a round indentation or just outlined with soot, it keeps the house warm without a stove, without a pipe, without insulation. Smoke drifts into the darkness, through the ceiling, through gaps in the roof, past corners. If you're lucky, there's a hole above the hearth, an exhaust vent. But more often, nothing. That's why the ceilings in these huts are always black. The ribs of the ceiling are covered with soot. The herbs hanging to dry become charcoal. But nobody complains, because the smoke repels insects, dries the air, it preserves the meat, and keeps the house from rotting. In Rus, such houses were called kearney huts. Kur means smoke. They existed until the 18th century in the northern and eastern regions. People lived in them in winter and summer, cooked directly on coals, smoked food, treated coals with smoke. One window, one door, not much light, but the heat stays in, and that's enough. The hearth worked around the clock. It was not extinguished at night. When leaving the house, it was left to smolder under the ashes. In the morning, it was rekindled. If the fire went out, it was a disaster. No matches, no one has flint. So we go to a neighbor, ask for coal, carry it in a pot, shivering so it doesn't go out on the way. That's why fire is like bread. It is kept, it is passed on, it is feared to be lost. They ate by the hearth, they slept by it, they gathered around it. It was a kitchen, a bedroom, a chapel, a pantry, sometimes an operating room. Herbs hung in the smoke to dry, fish so they wouldn't go rotten. Dishes were placed by the heat to sanitize them. Archaeological excavations in Scandinavia, in Russia, in Eastern Europe, in Irish peasant huts of the extant 30 centuries reveal the same thing. Traces of an open hearth in the center, a ring of charred stones, a thick layer of ash, soot in the corners and ceilings. These houses had no chimneys, but they had heat, and that was more important. Smoke ate his eyes. My throat ached. The children coughed. But if there was smoke, everything was all right. That means people are living in the house. It meant the walls were still warm, and if it wasn't coming out, it was an alarm. Maybe they're gone. Maybe they're dead. Maybe it went out and that's it. The hearth is not a part of the house, it's its soul. Rough, smoky, but alive. As long as there's something burning in it, the house is alive. As long as there's heat in it, we can wait for spring. And if one day all that's left is smoke on the ceiling, it means someone survived and built a new fire in the same place. Because if they didn't, everything else would be meaningless. In a long winter, when the furnace does not pull and the hearth fades under a layer of ash, the main source of heat is not the walls or the roof, but a living body, warm, damp, breathing nearby. In the corner, against the wall, on the ground. Livestock in the house is not a violation of order. It is the order itself. The peasant built a hut not only for himself. Half of the room, a third, or even the whole thing was shared with a cow, goats, sheep, and pigs. Even chickens lived inside, not out of pity, out of necessity. Because every animal is a warming point, a breath in the cold, a battery that doesn't need to be set on fire. The stable was not a separate building. It was built as a part of the house, under one roof, sometimes at the entrance, sometimes at the same level as the people, sometimes a little lower, so that the warm air from the animals would rise up and warm the air where the children slept. There could be a simple partition between livestock and people, made of poles, planks, straw bundles, but more often there was nothing. The space was shared. A man lay down on a bench, a cow, on straw, 2 steps away. Between them, a hearth, smoke above them, all together, one breathing structure. The floor was shared, not wooden, not clean. It was earthen, tamped down, sometimes covered with dry grass or straw. Manure was shoveled off when the weather permitted, but often it just lay there drying out, mixing with the dust. The smell was part of the house. They didn't notice it. They lived in it. If it smelled, it was warm. If it didn't smell, it meant no cattle. And without cattle, you couldn't survive. Historical descriptions and archaeological evidence show the ubiquity of this practice. In Norway, Iceland, and Sweden, they built langus, long houses where people and livestock lived under one roof, separated only by wooden posts. In alpine villages, woonstall house, where animals were placed on the lower level. In Russia, pentastenki, chopped huts with an attached cattle corner. Even in England, until the 16th century, village houses with stone-paved compartments for animals were found right next to the living area. It was an economic and climatic calculation. Building a separate stable means doubling the costs. To heat 2 rooms is impossible. It's dangerous to keep an eye on the cattle in the cold. That's why it's all under one roof, like a family, like a pack. The cattle were not let out in winter, only cleaned. Sometimes they did not even take out the dung. They themselves lived on a floor made of dry grass, hides, or rags. Skins were dried over the animals, herbs over the hearth, and children next to them, all in one warm, moist, living box. The goat was breathing down the back of his neck. The hen was crowing under the bench. The cow shuffled her feet in a half-sleep. All these were the sounds of the night, rustles that suggested all is well. Everyone is alive. Everyone is here. The house that didn't have livestock was quieter, cleaner, but colder, and therefore more dangerous. And as long as there's a cow breathing, a pig grunting, a chicken flapping its wing, there is life in this house. It's not clean, but it's warm, and that's enough to welcome another spring. Bare feet, wet, cold. In the night, when the hearth dies down and the roof stops holding heat, the only thing that feels right is the ground beneath my feet. Not the floor, not the decking, not the pavement. It's the ground itself, the one from which you were born, into which you bury a dead chicken, and into which everyone who now breathes in this house will one day go. The floor in a medieval peasant dwelling was most often not built. It was not designed, it was not leveled, it was not covered. It was just there. The ground trampled by feet, beaten by soles, soaked with smoke, drops of fat, cattle urine, rainwater that seeped through the straw. He was alive and fearful of it. It remembered who walked on it, and it kept everything. When it got cold, straw was thrown on the floor, often wet, often smelly, but better straw than bare earth. Sometimes old skins with torn fur and hay residue were laid on the floor. Sometimes rags when they didn't stick to the body anymore. Sometimes nothing, just lay down on the floor, by the hearth, closer to the warmth. The dirt was eternal. It wasn't washed away, it was raked. Sometimes once a week, sometimes once a month. Sometimes before a holiday. They sweep out the ashes, they cleaned up the bones, they lifted the old straw. New straw was piled up, and again, days and weeks when everything happened on this earth. Eating, fighting, giving birth, coughing, dying. Some homes, especially in northern and affluent regions, had planking. Simple, unplanked planks, or hewn logs laid across. These floors creaked, blew, rotted. But you could sit on them, or fall and not get dirty, or get warm a little faster. Sometimes such flooring was put only in one part of the house, where they slept, or where there was a bench. Everything else remained clay. Archaeologists find earthen floors in almost every surviving village house of the 14th centuries. Scotland, Ireland, Russia, Prussia. Traces of soot mixed with crumbs of wood, coal, wool. Sometimes, in one layer, found traces of tens of years of life. Footprints, puddles of grease, layers of ash stacked in layers like a chronicle. Sometimes the floor went lower, where a hole was dug to keep the cold air in. That's where they kept the meat, or hid a stash, or bury a dead cat. All on the same level, all on the same plane. Paul didn't divide the house, he was connecting. Man and livestock, man and fire, man and death. They sat on it, they lived on it. Children crawled on it, old men slept on it. It absorbed everything from odors to blood. It was feared, but it was also embraced, because it was, and there was no other. The floor in a peasant's house was not the foundation. It was the boundary between the living and the passing. It gave no rest, but it did not betray. It held when the legs gave out, and took it when the body lay down for the last time. He was not built, it was just tolerated, and it continued to be lived on. It's always dark in the house, even during the day, even in summer, even when the sun is high. Light does not pour into the room. It seeps in like smoke, like steam, like the faint odor of spring. There is no glass window in a peasant's house. It is not inserted, it is not cut through. It is forced in, only where it is possible, and not for long. A window is simply an opening in a wall, in a wattle and daub wall. Between the stakes, between the wainscoting, a small slit, more often square, sometimes a round hole the size of the palm of your hand. If the house is richer, 2 windows. If the house is poorer, 1. If the north, None. No glass, no ground, no frames, no transparency. In the villages of the Middle Ages, glass was only seen in churches, stained glass, where it shimmered, sparkled, but did not warm. In a peasant's hut, it was pointless. It lets cold in, costs a lot, and can't be repaired. They didn't put it in because there was nothing to put in. The window was shut, always. In the fall with rags, in winter with moss, hemp, wool scraps. If there was an old skin in the house, it was nailed or propped up from below. A piece of leather, oiled cloth, a board, sometimes just a shield of branches and straw, any material that could keep the heat inside and keep the wind out. An open window was an invitation to the cold. A draft could blow out the fire, draw in moisture, break the cast iron in which dinner was cooking. In January, any opening is a threat. That's why during the day they opened it briefly, only to let air in, to let smoke out. The rest of the time, plugged, insulated, forgotten. And yet you need a window. Without it, it's dark. Without it, there's nowhere to look. It allowed me to see the field, the wind, a bird, a neighbor passing by. Through the window, the peasants could hear the rooster crowing, the children shouting, the cart creaking. The whole outside world was coming through the window, at least a little, at least sometimes. Sometimes the window was replaced by a translucent material. In England, they used a stretched bull's bladder or oiled cloth. In Scandinavia, mica. In more southern regions, horn, sawed thinly. In Russia, scraped and stretched intestines. All of this is rare, all for those who could afford a small luxury, to see and not to freeze at the same time. But most of the windows were practically dead, didn't open, didn't glow. Part of the wall, like a stitched wound, sometimes only slightly open for spring, for the harvest, Easter, and then they put it back up again. Archaeological evidence emphasizes that windows are rare in peasant houses in Europe before the 15th century. Even air holes are minimal. In the frame buildings of Germany, in the shacks of Eastern Europe, in the log huts of Russia and Scandinavia, if there was a window, it functioned as a ventilation valve, not as a source of light. Inside the house, they didn't navigate by light. It was by smell, by footsteps, habit. They distinguished morning by the gray gap in the ceiling, evening by the disappearance of faces. The day could only be brighter by the fire, but no one complained. Because you can live with darkness, you can't live with the cold. A window without glass is a solution. Cruel but necessary. It's not made bigger than it needs to be. It is not kept open longer than it can be. It is not decorated, it's plugged up. Because the most important thing in a house is warmth. And light can be tolerated, even if you live in the dark for months, even if winter lasts 6 months, even if you can only see the faces of your relatives in the flames. Otherwise, you can't survive. It's quiet inside. Space is almost non-existent. The walls are close. The ceiling is low. You have to duck to get through. To lie down, you have to move. Everything is close. Everything is at hand. Everything is close. But in this cramped, almost suffocated space, there is the main thing: warmth. And that means we can survive another night. A peasant's house was not built for the sake of space. Space is the enemy in these parts. It doesn't warm. It rings in the wind. It draws in the cold like a rag draws in moisture. More air means more wood, more food, more strength to sustain life. And wood is scarce. There is only one hearth. People get tired. The house must be small. We shared a room, the whole family, sometimes 6, sometimes 15, sometimes with a grandmother, a baby, and 2 goats. No one ever wondered whose corner was whose. Everything was shared: floor, bench, benches, bunks, benches. Every centimeter was occupied. Anything that doesn't get in the way is used. Everything that was not used was taken out or used for firewood. The bunks along the wall made of rough boards served everyone at once. They slept there. Things were stored there. Under them, straw, sometimes sacks of grain, sometimes a chicken. They slept in rows side by side, one to the other. Children against the wall, women closer to the exit, men to the fire, shoulder to shoulder, back to the smoke, face to the warmth. The bench is both a seat, a bed, and a shelf. They peel vegetables on it during the day, cover hides in the evening, and tuck themselves in at night. Everything is compact. It's all close together. There's nothing extra. The corner is a pantry, a shelf for a candle. The beam under the ceiling is a drying rack for herbs. Above the hearth, a bag of salt. Against the wall, a clay pot in which to put bread, if there is any. Everything knows its place, because there is no other. The walls are low. The ceiling is at arm's length. It's not an architectural miscalculation. It's a survival calculation. The lower the ceiling, the less volume to warm. The heat from the hearth doesn't go up. It stays, circulates, mixes with the smoke. The heat builds up under the roof itself. That's where they dry the fish. That's where the nets are kept. It keeps precious food safe from rodents and moisture. The windows are tiny. Sometimes there are none. Sometimes there's one crack. Because light is a leak, a draft, a problem. An extra window means extra wind, which means unnecessary death. Archaeological studies of frame, Mazankov, and log buildings of 18th, 14th centuries all over Europe, from Sweden to Hungary, from Russia to Brittany, confirm the majority of peasant houses were one volume. The size, 4 by 5 meters, sometimes a little more, sometimes smaller. Everything inside was merged into one: kitchen, bedroom, workshop, stable. It wasn't an accident. It was a system developed over centuries. It wasn't poverty, it was climate. Because of the threats, because of understanding how to keep warm when there's a 6-month winter outside. A house like that was cramped, noisy, full of smells, voices, footsteps. It was impossible to be alone in it, to think, to be quiet. But you could survive in it, and in those days that was a luxury. The smaller the air, the easier it is to warm. The closer the bodies, the slower the heat escapes. A peasant doesn't dream of a spacious room. He dreams that no child dies in it, that the hearth doesn't go out, to wake up in the morning and live again. And that's what a small house is for. Small but warm, pressing but alive. And that's what a real shelter's all about. No blueprints, no paperwork, no time to think about what's best. There's only necessity. We need to build a house. Not a beautiful one, not a comfortable one, not an eternal one, but one where you won't freeze, not to rot, don't die before spring. A house that you can make yourself. Out of earth, sticks, and breath. The masters were not called, there were none. And even if there was a carpenter or mason somewhere, there was no point in calling him. He worked in monasteries, castles, churches. In the village, every peasant was his own architect, laborer, and surveyor. Everything he knew didn't come from a book. It came from his father's hands, from observation, from his own calluses. The first knowledge is how to stick the stakes, then how to weave the rods, then how to knead clay and dung, treading it with bare feet, then how to dry straw to keep the roof from rotting. None of this was learned in school. It happened simply because there was no other way. Without it, a man was without a roof, and without a roof, no chance. The house was built by the whole family, or the whole village. First you helped others, then you called for help yourself. No bargaining, no payment, just in order. One day, log or frame. Second day, walls. Third day, roof. Then the hearth, the bunks, the door. Everything else was done later, sometimes never. Every movement was communicated verbally. Where the beam should stand so that the roof does not fall through. What slope to make so that water would run off. How to trim the moss to plug the gaps. When to knead clay at full moon or before the first frost. Where to get straw so it wouldn't smolder. There was no superstition in these details. Only experience. Only knowledge honed by centuries. Archaeologists and ethnographers note that in the peasant cultures of Europe, up to the 17th century, almost the entire building tradition is a tradition of oral transmission. In the German village, in the Russian sloboda, in the Norwegian farm, nowhere were there records, plans, norms. Only living craft, ingrained in the body. It was knowledge transmitted while working, in silence, in the repetitive rhythm of the axe, the hand, the fingers. Not theoretical, but sensual. That's why the houses were similar. They differed in details, but kept to the same code. Small volume, thick walls, sloping roofs, hearths without chimneys, shuttered windows, low doors. It's not a style, it's a set of conditions, something that has proven its right to exist through time and the death of other, less successful solutions. The house has been built more than once. It's been patched up. It's been added to. It was repaired in the spring, re-roofed in the fall, put up in the summer. It grew old with its owner. It cracked, it shrank, settled, and still it stood, because they knew him by touch, by hearing, by smell, because it was built not by line, but by memory. Building a house was a must. There was no excuse. A man who didn't know how to build a roof and paper a wall could not be considered an adult, couldn't start a family, couldn't shelter his children from the rain, so he was a nobody. A house built with one's own hands was not something to be proud of. It was a condition of life and proof that you could do it, at least with this. Anything, no glass, no nails, no plans, but with a memory in my body and the earth beneath my feet. The house of a medieval peasant is not about coziness. It's not about interior design. It's not even about safety. It's about survival. It's about warmth, not fuel, but bodies. It's about walls that don't so much protect as hold back the winter. It's built from what's underfoot. The earth is the floor, dung is the wall, straw is the roof. The hearth is not an oven, but a smoking heart. There is no privacy, no light, no silence. But there is one thing, a cohesive space in which to live, or at least not to die. Every crack, every rag in the window, every board nailed crookedly, all these are not signs of poverty. They are the marks of struggle, not for comfort, for the next morning, for the sake of keeping the hearth warm, so that the child doesn't freeze, so that someone from this darkness can still come out into the dawn. If you want to know more about how people lived in a world without glass, without concrete, without electricity, but with the will to live stronger than steel, subscribe to the channel. Here we are not talking about myths, but about reality, about real survival architecture, about houses that were not held together by nails, but by memory, smoke, and stubbornness.